Okay, in this presentation we're going to talk about the scientific revolution and relate it to the Enlightenment. Aristotle was the first to come up with a natural philosophy that influenced the entire world. Aristotle believed there were four elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. He believed that objects move in straight lines and that there was such a thing as specific gravity. That is, objects that were made of earth wanted to be near the earth, objects that were made of air wanted to be near the air, etc. This specific gravity meant that earth was down, fire was up, and that predicted the degree to which things would fall towards the earth or float into the air. He believed that heavens moved in a perfect circle through the ether and that the universe was unchanging and permanent. Ptolemy, an Egyptian who came after Aristotle chronologically, had similar beliefs to Aristotle, but he modified Aristotle's beliefs. He believed that the Earth was in the center of the solar system, but that the physical properties on the Earth were the same as those described by Aristotle. The universe is static and eternal in Ptolemy's view, and everything that flies outside of the Earth's sphere is flying in perfect circles and is universal and unchanging, but the Earth is imperfect, and that's why physical properties here are different. Planets in Ptolemy's system move east to west, but since the planets sometimes appear to move backwards when looking at them from the Earth, Ptolemy posited that the planets actually have epicycles, that is, small rotations within their spheres that explain those movements. To a great degree, the scientific revolution was contingent on things that came before. One of them was the development of various scientific theories and ideas in the Arab world. This is a drawing of Al-Khwarizmi, who developed algebra and linear algebra and several other mathematical concepts that we still use today. Alhazen developed the knowledge of how the eye works and how optics work. The Arab world was very productive when it comes to science, and Europeans in the Middle Ages learned much from them. Another way that Europeans learned from Arabs was that Arabs had texts in Arabic that had been translated from the ancient texts of the Greeks, the Romans, and other ancient Europeans. In Europe, most of those texts, or many of them, had been lost. This is a map of the pilgrim route from France into Spain to the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, where Europeans found access to many of those ancient lost texts in Arabic and translated them into European languages. This also helped move the scientific revolution forward. Of course, along with this, in 1457, Johann Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, where small letters were made of lead and then arranged to create words so that he could print pages of books very quickly and easily at low cost. And for the first time, books became both small enough to carry and affordable enough to buy for at least people who might be in the low range of the upper class, professionals like lawyers and doctors. It became possible to get books in Europe after 1457, and this meant that knowledge could be transmitted much more easily. Another contingent experience of Europeans was the Council of Trent, which ran from 1545 to 1563. It met in response to the Reformation and the charges by Martin Luther and others that the Catholic Church was not following proper scripture. But in the process of working on its doctrine, the Catholic Church was also revised by Pope Gregory XIII and charged with revising the calendar. The calendar was based on lunar cycles, and they had to add an extra month every 19 years or so to make the time work out. So Pope Gregory asked the council to find someone to revise the calendar, and that person was Copernicus. Copernicus was a deacon in the Catholic Church. He was also an amateur mathematician. And in order to make the 365-day calendar work out with the seasons and avoid the intercalary month and fit with all of the other seasonal things that Europeans had noticed, Copernicus decided that he would imagine the sun in the center of the universe and have the Earth go around that. That worked mathematically, but Copernicus was so worried about whether or not he was right that he refused to publish his book until 1543, which was also the year he died. This created a revolution, but at the same time, people like Galileo Galilei, who were also mathematicians and observers of nature, began to test physical properties of objects in the rest of the world in very specific ways that were not necessarily related to the planets. Galileo, for example, tested gravity by rolling balls down a ramp. He didn't invent, but he improved on the telescope and was able to see planets moving around, particularly the moons of Jupiter, or moons of Saturn, moving around Saturn. And Galileo then began to recognize that observation, experimentation, and mathematics were the best way to describe the world. He also came to believe that science and religion were absolutely compatible. He believed that in order to understand the world, it was his duty as a Christian to use the brain and the observation faculties, such as his eyes, his hands, his ears, his nose, that God had given him in order to understand the world, and to use his mathematical skills to make sense of it. So his observation led to experimentation, which he believed was a religious act. Tycho Brahe, who was also an observer of the universe and the follower of the Ptolemaic system, tried to prove that Copernicus was right by observing and mapping over 700 stars in a 20-year period. He used this particular observatory that you see here on the slide to quadrant the universe and then make his observations. His observations disagreed with the Ptolemaic system. They showed that the universe changed, that it didn't change according to an east-to-west rotation of the planets. And in 1572, he watched a supernova appear and then disappear in the constellation Cassiopeia, which made him recognize that the universe was not permanent and unchanging. Johannes Kepler was an assistant of Tycho Brahe's, who was not just a pure mathematician. He also was very much into horoscopes and astrology, and used numerology. But he was in charge of mapping all of the different observations that Brahe had made and mathematically analyzing them after Brahe's death. His analysis led to a recognition that planetary orbits around the sun were elliptical, not circular, and that the planets described a triangle whose area was the same no matter what distance they were from the sun, which meant that planets did not speed up and slow down, but because of the different distances, the degree of arc that they covered, depending on how far they were from the sun, was different. Sir Isaac Newton is the person who really sort of put all of this together. Galileo's observations, Copernicus' observations, Brahe and Kepler's observations, and eventually Isaac Newton wrote a book about basic physics and how objects moved through space. And in it, the key to understanding everything was his theory of gravitation, which was really a triumph of observation, experimentation, and putting all of these different theories together. So scientists communicating with scientists and working off of the work of each other. And this was Isaac Newton's key understanding. What's interesting is that medicine went through a similar process. The Greek physician Galen was similar in stature to Aristotle, and he believed that the body had 4 humors, which is sort of reminiscent of Aristotle's 4 elements. Those 4 humors or liquids kept the body in balance, and keeping those 4 humors in balance was the key to health, according to Galen. So from Galen's time all the way into the Middle Ages, the most frequent medical treatment for illness in Europe was to bleed people in order to bring these different humors back into balance. Eventually, Paracelsus, with influence from Arab physicians who had invented vaccines, began experimenting to see how people responded to different drugs when they were ill, and even, like the Arabs, injected different elements into people's bodies to try and cure illness. Andreas Vesalius, who lived at about the same time as Paracelsus, also broke taboos by dissecting human bodies to learn about human anatomy and figure out treatments. Once again, as with astronomy and physics, observation, hypothesis, and experimentation were the keys to this change. The scientific method was applied in medicine as in other new branches of practical science. René Descartes was a mathematician who was also interested in finding out larger questions, for example, the existence of life, etc. And Descartes decided that to do this, he would deny anything that he could not prove internally without reference to external objects. Eventually, by denying the existence of nearly everything, Descartes wound up recognizing that he could hear himself think. And he decided that since he could be aware of himself thinking, that proved his own existence. That has to do with the idea of I think, therefore I am. In understanding that, René Descartes recognized his own existence, and he also posited the existence of God. Sir Francis Bacon took issue with Descartes' method, which was deductive, going from general principles to specific answers. And instead, Bacon claimed that proper science could only work if you used the inductive method, using specific observations of specific events in order to find general principles that applied to all. This was the basis of the scientific method, which you can see here, beginning with an observation of specific patterns. One comes up with a theory or a hypothesis. You use that hypothesis to make a prediction and experiment with that prediction. If the evidence, that is the results of your experiment, prove that the prediction is correct, then you can go back and call that a theory. However, if they are negative, then you go back to create a new theory and experiment with that again. Now, all of this application of rational thought to the way that the world worked eventually led to a set of ideas that we call the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment really is simply the practical application of reason to human societies rather than to the physical world. The first and most influential group of people to talk about this and try and apply reason to human populations was Voltaire and other writers who called themselves the philosophes. They popularized this rationalism in books that they wrote and in speeches that they gave and discussions at various salons, etc. And they came to believe that reason could solve the problems of the world. This is because they believed that humans, like animals and even like stones and sticks and wind, were part of the natural world and therefore predictable and understandable through natural laws. And this, of course, to them meant that humans and human society was perfectible. The 18th century also saw an increase in the number and percentages of people living in cities in Europe. This led to new ways of thinking about public necessity and provided the proximity necessary to socialize easily. During this time, it was common for wealthy families to entertain guests in monthly or weekly salons, which was just the name of the room where gatherings were generally held. During these gatherings, social talk often revolved around the new ideas and discoveries of the day, and it became fashionable to invite scientists and intellectuals, as well as public figures, priests, and other powerful individuals to attend. Here, scientific results were discussed, new questions debated, and ideas about the application of new theories tossed around. These salons thus became a public sphere where ideas could be exchanged, and politically and culturally important people could learn about the new possibilities and consider how to use them to improve society. Catherine the Great of Russia was one of many rulers who considered themselves, or were considered by intellectuals, to be enlightened monarchs. In the continent of Europe, most thinkers believed that change from below was extremely difficult. They felt that change could best be effected from above and placed their hopes in what they called an enlightened monarch. This was not simply a despot, but a king or queen who ruled through reason and listened to the reason of Enlightenment advisors. Monarchs such as Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, and Maria Theresa of Austria reformed their governments, laws, and societies in line with Enlightenment ideals. Their primary goals, however, were rationalization of the state, to centralize the administration, make the collection of tax revenue more efficient, reduce costs, and increase royal and state power through efficient use of funds and improved weapons through science and experimentation. They did not share power and were not interested in democracy at all, nor in capitalism unless they could gain from it, and maintained some control over the economy. John Locke, an Englishman, was a bit different in stripe. He didn't accept the idea of enlightened absolutism at all. And in fact, like the philosophes, he applied rationalism to society, but he argued that a diverse society was best, that we needed to tolerate various different ideas in our society, and that is because society is a contract. It's an ultimate agreement among diverse individuals, and those individuals give up some of their freedom to protect the rest of their freedom. This means that Locke believed in freedom of economic activity, freedom of speech, freedom from government demands, and he believed that the government was a part of the contract that people created when they formed a society. And that meant for Locke that if government overstretched its boundaries, people had the right, and maybe even the duty, to overthrow government. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was, like Locke, doubtful of the idea of absolute monarchy, and in fact even doubtful that reason could alone solve the problems of society. But Rousseau also thought that humans created societies through a social contract, a kind of agreement, unwritten, that people used to live together in peace, and that this agreement meant that every society was a republic. Rousseau believed that democracy doesn't work because there were too many individuals in a large society and there was no way that a conversation could occur, but that a republic does work in which people elect representatives to essentially manage the contract for them. So Rousseau believes that humans are not rational, but they are responsible for each other in a society which they agree to join. Ultimately, the scientific revolution may have been the beginning of the modern world, but it was the result of the ideas and investigations of the past. It was contingent on the preservation of knowledge and the production of new knowledge about the world, mathematics and medicine in the Middle East. Without the ability to rediscover ancient texts and learn from Arab scholars such as Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Hayezan, the foundation of the scientific revolution would have been unavailable. Likewise, the scientific method depended upon communication among the new scientists. The beginnings of organized postal systems and the printing press made information widely available and inexpensive, allowing for poorly regarded scholars of science who had little money to communicate with each other deeply. It is also true that most of the early scientists were deeply religious, inspired by their Christian faith to use the gifts of perception and intelligence that they believed God had given humans to learn about the world in which they lived and understand how to take advantage of the natural world they believed was God's gift to humans. Thus, the scientific revolution was contingent on many developments.